Perfect. Okay. So Dana and Patricia, I'm going to turn it over to you, and I'll let you get started.
Okay. Thank you so much. Very happy to be here. And I wanted to just say, I appreciate the introduction, Michelle. I want to just emphasize, I'm not an expert in trauma-informed care. I am an eternal learner about trauma-informed care. I think that's really important. I also want to emphasize that I'm a school psychologist by training. I worked in a district for 17 years before taking on this role at Cooperative Educational Services. And sort of my mission in speaking about some of the trauma-informed care efforts we are making is to help us move beyond sort of a cliched concept of what trauma is. I think sometimes there's an assumption that trauma only lives in certain places and in certain spaces and in certain communities. And I think we need to be really mindful of that here and now, given, so many factors that have sort of been put upon us in the last few years between COVID and between sort of the political divides that we're in right now, and how that affects us as adults, but also our kids and what they're seeing in the world around them. Patricia, is this a good time to pause?
Well, I don't know. I mean, everything is being wonderfully translated on the screen.
Okay.
And I don't know if there's any need.
Well, I don't know that we'll have to do it. I mean, if there's questions, then maybe you can answer them directly here.
Sure.
Does that make sense?
¿Está bien con ustedes? ¿Tiene la traducción en la pantalla?
Oh, sí, porque yo lo que sé es en español, no sé nada de inglés, está bien, sí.
Sí, porque acabamos de encontrar este nuevo detalle aquí que podemos traducir la reunión. Y todo lo que pueden hablar lo pueden leer. Entonces,
yeah. Okay. Dana, you're able to see on the screen what's being translated as well?
I can. And please just, be mindful. I like to talk, but I want this to be more of a conversation. So please stop me. Feel free to interrupt in what some people might think is a rude way, because I won't mind it at all. And just to give you a little bit of context, I am a mom. I have an 11-year-old girl. And so anybody out there who's got an 11-year-old girl, I'm with you, praying for you and me. And then I have an 8-year-old son as well. And I think one thing also that I want to, just to give you some context about this work, when I worked in my prior district, I spent 11 years at a building that was 60% multilingual learners. So I think it's part of my mission to make sure that we are soliciting voice from all of the members of our community. I think there are some places that do a really good job of it. But I find that, sort of in speaking to this work and speaking to equity from a trauma-informed lens, I think that's one way we can empower all of the voices that exist in our community. So that's just my own little personal mission, my own aside. So just wanted to share that with you. So we'll get started. So I don't know if anyone has seen any of these terms or heard about any of this work happening in the district. There's lots of language out there. There are lots of initiatives out there in schools right now. I think a lot of it was born out of wanting to support kids out of the pandemic. But again, social emotional learning, diversity, equity, and inclusion, restorative practices, self-care. I think that what I've seen a trend, across districts is we're trying to do all of these things, when in reality, I don't know that they all differ from one another. So part of the work is also figuring out how do we make all of these things sort of integrate with one another, because I don't see them necessarily as separate things. Any questions so far?
No.
So this is where I need you to talk a little bit. So if I asked you to define trauma, how would you define it? No right or wrong answers, just a curiosity.
I'm not allowed to answer, so.
I will just try to open the conversation, okay? I think that trauma is a problem that you have and you don't know well how to handle it.
That's an absolutely perfect start. And thank you for being brave, being the first
Oh,
one.
okay.
I apologize if I'm looking side to side. I prefer to be in person myself, but I recognized a lot of people would be on the screen. So I like to be able to engage with folks. So I'm trying to pay attention to nonverbals as well. Anybody else? Anything to add? So it sounds like, Franco, what you had said, it's something that happens to you that overwhelms your capacity to cope, right? Anything else that folks would add? It's okay. Nobody needs to share. But in the work that I'm doing, we utilize an acronym, the 3 E's of trauma. So number one, trauma is the result of an event or a series of events. I think that's one thing that we have to emphasize. It may be one single event. And I think a lot of time when people hear the word trauma, they think this big T trauma, one single big event. But it can also be a series of events that happens to an individual or a set of individuals over time. The next piece of that is the experience of that event. So irregardless of where we are coming from, your experience of the event may be very different than mine. And a lot of that is based on, number one, do I have supportive factors in my life that help me to cope with it? And what's my previous experience? So for example, and I'm looking at Viviana right now, if we got into a car accident together, perhaps I've already been in a car accident before, and this is a very minor car accident. Everybody's fine. Nothing, there's a little bit of a fender bender. So I'm walking away from it, not overly stressed about it. Whereas Viviana has never been in a car accident before. She doesn't know what to expect. So it impacts and affects her much, much more than it might. So I guess the point being that trauma or, traumatic and adverse experiences are experienced very differently by individuals. That's an individualized experience. And then finally, the effect or effects. So what we do know about toxic stress and trauma, there are significant and long-term effects on our neurological development, so our brain development, on our language skills, on our memory functioning. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a little while, but also in terms of our physical health and our frankly, our longevity of life. So for folks that have experienced significant trauma, there are some studies that say that their life expectancy is shortened by about 20 years based on the significant events. So again, the 3 E's are kind of anchoring us in that definition of trauma. So trauma-informed care really emphasizes the need to establish really strong, connected, and trusting relationships with folks in our environment. So again, we're also assuming that anyone we encounter might have experienced adversity in our lives. Anybody in this room never experienced adversity? Nope, right? We always ask that question. That said, it doesn't mean that everyone that's experienced some adversity or a potentially traumatic event develops a trauma response as a result of it. So again, the point being, we walk into every conversation, we walk into every interaction, assuming that there may be something that we don't know. I can share with you a little bit of information. There was a very famous study, the ACEs study. Is anybody familiar with the ACEs study out there in the universe? And it's okay if you're not. But it was a study that was conducted in the early 90s by the Centers for Disease Control and Kaiser Permanente, which is a major insurance company. And, sort of the beginning of the study was they were looking at folks that were in a weight loss program. And they were finding that folks were doing really, really well in that weight loss program. But over time, many of the people gained the weight back and they would come back. So as we know, insurance companies, they want to save money, right? So they said, let's figure out what's impacting this group. So they did sort of a backward study. And what they found was that for folks that had experienced trauma early on in life, they were more likely to have significant health issues like cardiovascular disease or diabetes or substance abuse. It was a very well done study. It had there were 17,000 people that were part of it. It's been replicated over and over again. One of the sort of key takeaways from that, and I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, but they were finding that women were struggling the most with the weight loss. And these were women that had experienced abuse early on in life, oftentimes sexual abuse. And what they were seeing is that as they were losing weight, they were getting more attention from a romantic perspective, and it made them feel very uncomfortable. And so they would regain that weight. So again, we see that when we experience trauma, there are not only changes in terms of our physical health, but in terms of our emotional health, our ability to connect to others, our feelings of safety. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that as we go through. Any questions so far? Okay. So what are adverse childhood experiences? So in that study that was done by Felitti and his colleagues, they gave a questionnaire to all of the participants that had 10 questions, and they asked about certain adversities that they might have experienced in life. Two of the sort of major categories that they looked at were whether or not individuals had experienced abuse, whether it be physical abuse, emotional abuse, or sexual abuse, and then also neglect. So looking at whether or not their parents were attuning to them, whether they were paying attention to their physical needs. And I think, again, just to bring it back, I think there's an assumption sometimes that in more affluent communities, we don't have abuse, we don't have neglect, when in reality rates of domestic violence are actually higher in more affluent towns. And I would also say that I think there are times when, from an emotional or physical perspective, parents are not as available, even when parents are maybe have the financial means to support kids, right? So there are lots of stressors that can contribute to either of these things being present in home. Abuse and neglect being something that is directly experienced by a child, potentially. The next are household challenges. So these are not directly experienced by a child, but things that they might bear witness to or be exposed to in their homes. So maybe a parent is abusing alcohol, or maybe there is mental health issues within the home or the family. Divorce or separation can be a very traumatic event, and clearly it's a very common thing in our world right now. So I think sometimes we normalize it or minimize it when it can be really significant. And then we have families that are involved with the justice system, and and there's domestic violence as well. Anything on here that we don't have?
Dana, are you showing your presentation?
Am I not sharing?
No,
Oh, I'm so sorry, guys.
that's okay.
Thank you for letting me know.
Well, no. I just was like listening because.
How's that? Better? Oy vey. Okay. I'm like thinking, what do I need to go back to? All right. You guys will have a copy of this. Can you see it now?
Yes.
Oh, beautiful. Okay. Thank you for that reminder. I'm a Zoomer normally.
Oh, okay.
And then finally, we think about other adversity that we experience. So in schools, we talk a lot about bullying, right? Something that we're very mindful of and has had a huge effect and been a topic of conversation for probably 25 to 30 years. We think about violence in the community. Obviously, certain communities are more prone to violence or gang-related violence, natural disasters. And then I think about the influx of refugees or wartime folk that have come and they're in the States and sort of enmeshed in a culture that's unfamiliar. And then some of the natural barriers that exist in some of our communities where there is resistance and a lack of acceptance of newcomers. And I think that's something we really have to talk about in a very honest way. That kind of brings me back to the very beginning where I said how important it is that we solicit voice and feedback. I think sometimes we solicit it and folks don't necessarily provide feedback. Maybe they're fearful, or maybe they're not seeing any meaningful change as a result of that advocacy. But I think there is space for that. And I see someone has a hand raised.
Yes. Sorry to interrupt a little bit. I just trying to read the Hispanic translation, and it's a little bit hard for me. Can you slow it down a little bit, please? Because it's
absolutely. Thank you so much.
Sorry, I'm trying my best.
No, you're
my broken English is like, but thank you, please.
And I think this is the first time everyone is using the translation through the platform. So I think this is very good learning for all of us. So at any rate, the point being that for folks that have experienced these adversities in childhood, and when we say adverse childhood experiences, that's from truthfully before a child is even born, when they're in utero, up through age 17. So we're considering that is sort of the span of ages when we're thinking about adversity in childhood. Not to say we can't experience adversity after 17. I think the point I tend to drive home is that we are all of a certain age where we have decades of experience with life. And hopefully we've seen some ups and downs and we've come out on the other side, and we recognize that we can adapt to change in a dynamic way, whereas some of our kids don't have that capacity yet. So it takes less for them to feel overwhelmed. Does that make sense? Can I ask a question? How many high school parents do I have in here tonight?
Most everyone.
Most everyone?
Yes.
Okay, good to know. And I think that's another sort of challenge when we think about parental ability to be engaged in education in a very meaningful way, because high school is a natural time. We're expecting our kids to take on some responsibility and accountability and autonomy. And how do we balance that? And how do we make sure that we're getting information from school that's helpful to us, right? So we can support. And do we have access to people in school? You know, I will say, I think there are some parents that I've worked with in the past who've said, I don't even know who to go to. I feel kind of like at a loss if I have a question or if I need support. So I think high school can be, adds another layer of complexity to supporting our students who are experiencing a lot of stress, whether it be the stress of the social aspects of high school, whether it be the stress of, what am I doing post-secondary? Am I on a college route? Am I on a trade route? There's a variety of ways our kids can go, and how are we helping them to cope with that? Is that better, Di?
Yes.
Awesome. Thank you so much. All right. So when we look at the data about ACEs, nationally, about 2/3 of kids have experienced one or more of those ACEs that was listed on the previous slide. In Connecticut, we do a little bit better, but it's still 1 in 3 students have experienced one or more ACEs. And again, while I try to expand this concept and help folks understand, we have all experienced adversity. There are certainly some groups that are disproportionately impacted by adversity. So we see about 1/4 of kids from low-income households are experiencing 4 or more ACEs, which is sort of the tipping point. So, I can give you an example. My ACE score is 4, but I've had a lot of supports in my life that have allowed me to be able to recover from the things that I experience in my life. In other circumstances, we have kiddos that have the high level of adversity, but they don't have those buffers or supports. I think the other thing that's important to reflect upon is that adversity begets adversity. And oftentimes it's very much inherited, particularly when we think about some of the systemic barriers that exist in terms of disproportionality in discipline in schools, disproportionality in terms of gainful employment. Some marginalized groups, whether it be our Black students, our Hispanic students, our students who have disabilities, by no fault of their own, are at a disadvantage coming in the gate, right? So that is something we have been talking about endlessly and working really hard to combat, and recognize some of this is so systemic and ingrained that it's going to take a very long time to see that needle move. Is that a fair assessment? Are folks finding barriers of that kind? It's okay not to contribute too. I always ask just in case. I think part of the reason why, and again, I use trauma and toxic stress somewhat interchangeably. This is some data that came out soon after it's not after the pandemic. It was sort of within the 2 to 3 year span following the onset of the pandemic. This is Connecticut specific data. So almost half of the adults in the state were reporting symptoms of anxiety and depression. So it's not just about the kids. We set the tone, we set the temperature. So our adults were not doing very well, which leaves us with limited capacity to support. And then the other remarkable statistic that I always like to highlight is that 50% of kids in Connecticut didn't receive any care for anxiety and depression. And of those that did, where do you think they received the care?
School.
70% received that care in school. So again, it just goes back to show how important that connection and community between home and school is in order to support our kids best. So when we think about the different types of trauma that exist out there, again, obviously I shared that list of ACEs, those adverse childhood experiences, whether it's abuse, neglect, death of a family member. Those are sort of, the standard list that folks tend to think of. Another example would be an acute trauma. And acute trauma can be, it could be a dog bite, or it could be a school shooting. Again, a single one-time event that has the potential to really impact the folks that are involved. And acute trauma could be experienced by one person, or it can be experienced by a large number of people. One thing I often refer to, and again, I should have said this early on, in having conversations about trauma, sometimes it can be really activating based on your own personal experiences. This is a world that I live in, so I talk about this a lot. But you may find yourself in a place where like, this is making me feel really uncomfortable, or I had never really thought about my experience as potentially being traumatic. So I want folks to know that you're very welcome to not participate in the conversation, or if you do have questions or concerns, I would implore you to please connect with Michelle or even myself. I'll drop my email in the chat if you're in need of any support. A chronic trauma is that trauma that exists over a long sustained period of time. So again, if you're a family that's living chronically just at that poverty line, or a lot of housing insecurity, and that persists for many, many years, or if you're in a situation where there is domestic violence in the home, whether it be parental or whether it be sibling based. And then complex trauma is when we have multiple forms of trauma impacting an individual. I will also say that trauma begets trauma. So, as a very simple example, in a home where a parent has, let's say it's a single parent home, a parent has lost a job, which is causing them to become more stressed, which they have less patience, which means maybe they're shorter with their children and yelling at their children. And then to cope, they're using substances. So again, this is when you're seeing multiple forms of trauma in one place, in one space. And you can see how one can lead to the other. And without any intention on the part of the person who's perpetrating the trauma, the intention is not to harm their children. It's a coping mechanism that's not effective. Again, and then historical and racial trauma, when we think about how certain groups have historically been oppressed, or when we think about, and I think about this a lot in the public school system, and I shared this earlier, I worked in a building of almost 60% of our students were multilingual learners. We had the resources to support our parents. And it wasn't all Spanish-speaking families or Portuguese-speaking families. It was a wide range of languages. We had Polish-speaking families, Ukrainian families. And so, but we did have those resources to make sure that we were engaging our parents in a way that was meaningful, that they felt welcome, they felt part of that community. And I think from a school perspective, a lot of factors have impacted our ability to do that since, number one, since Sandy Hook, because, again, as we've seen sort of increased school violence and these sort of mass violence incidences, we've closed our doors. We've literally locked our doors, again, to preserve safety. And at the same time, it causes a different type of, it causes a disconnect in some ways as well, right? So we have to think about that trade-off. So again, starting to kind of break down and having those conversations. And I hope for families where they don't feel like they have access, that there is an outlet, that you have someone you can connect with. And again, I will share my email address. You can feel free to call or email at any time. And I'm very happy to support, or even just be a sounding board. So let's talk about our brains. Anybody know what the brainstem is for? I like talking about the brain, so forgive me.
Brainstem, what is it? You're on, what is it?
I don't know.
You all have one. So in general, our brains develop from the bottom up and from the back to the front. So when we are born as babies, The brainstem is really the only part of the brain that is fully developed and mature. And your brainstem is ultimately responsible for your survival. So it controls your heart rate, it controls your respiration, your breathing, it controls your elimination. So when you have to use the bathroom, it controls your need for hydration or food. So I always like to, this is my little funny. So when we have a baby, right, and they're hungry, it's not like Stewie on Family Guy where he's going to tell you, Mommy, I would like a bottle. What do they do when they're hungry?
Cry.
They cry.
Cry.
What do they do when they need someone to soothe them?
Cry.
What do they do when they need to be changed?
Right.
Cry.
I think I've articulated my point, right? So they're simply surviving based on instinct, right? So when we are faced with a stressor or something that causes fear, we go into survival mode. So we're either going to fight, we're going to run away, or we're going to freeze. So I want you to think about if outside your front door right now there was a bear, would you be thinking about what you could say to the bear to encourage him to go somewhere else? No, we wouldn't do any of those things, right? What would we do? I'm hoping nobody out there would go and fight with the bear because it's probably not the right choice. That being said, it's not a conscious choice. It's just something that happens. The next part of the brain to develop is the limbic system, and that starts around 6 weeks old. So the limbic system really is the emotional center of our brain. So a couple of important structures within the limbic system are the amygdala, which is how we regulate our emotions. So again, if I'm upset about something, am I having a huge reaction to it? Or am I able to take a step back, pause, and say, okay, this is not such a big deal, right? The other important structure in the limbic system is the hippocampus, which is responsible for memory. So part of the way all of this interacts is if we learn and remember fear as a response, we're more likely to always rely on the fight, flight, and freeze response. The other important thing with the limbic system is, again, it being the emotional center of our brain, this is where we start to connect to one another, right? So who knows what happens with babies around 6 to 7 weeks old? Anybody got little babies out there or just have a really good memory?
They start to sleep better.
They do start to sleep better because they're learning how to soothe a little bit. What else though? From a relationship standpoint, what happens with babies 6, 7 weeks?
So smile. I remember.
I think I heard somebody say smile, right?
They start to smile around that. I forgot.
Yeah, they start to smile. They see you as a human that they can interact with, right? There's that serve and return. I smile, you smile. They notice us. They look for us. And then finally, the last part of the brain to develop is the prefrontal cortex, which is really sort of the executive director, the manager of all of the other things in the brain. So our prefrontal cortex is responsible for decision-making, attentional control, so being able to pay close attention, our ability to prioritize information, like what do I need to do right now? What can I wait on? It also looks at our ability to think about problem solving. So if I have this problem, how am I going to go about it? How do I organize my thinking? So for individuals who've experienced trauma, that sense of threat causes literally the prefrontal cortex, that thinking part of our brain, and the limbic system, the emotional part of our brain, to shut down because it's only about survival in that moment. So sometimes we see our kids behaving in a way that folks might think of as oppositional or defiant, or they're struggling to stay focused, when it may not be an issue or a disability within them, but it may be the result of a trauma response. They're trying to save themselves, right? I want to ask all of you, when you are under stress, are you thinking very clearly?
No.
No.
Are you connecting in a way that is helpful with others, whether it be to them or to you?
No.
No. And I think some of us, like, again, this can develop to be a skill that I know that if I'm feeling dysregulated and stressed, I know I can go to Michelle because she's a trusted person. So that's where we start to talk about who is your person, right? So for kids, and particularly in high school, there's a lot of research to support that even if they have 1 or 2 adults that they feel they can trust with information, that might be enough, right? Or one or two peers that they can trust. So far, is all of this making sense?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. The sequence of engagement, I like to use this to kind of distill all the neurobiology, all the brain stuff very, very simply. So again, we think about that brain stem. Number one, am I safe, right? Is my nervous system regulated? So again, when we're in that fight, flight, and freeze mode, our bodies are flooded with adrenaline and cortisol, which are stress hormones, right? And that being in our body is going to cause tension. It's going to cause us to take shorter breaths. So the first thing that we need to do is to regulate our nervous systems when we're under stress. Does that mean we take deep breaths? Does that mean we eat something? Does that mean we get movement? So again, the number one thing we have to remember is that when folks are under stress, do they feel safe? Only when we feel safe can we start to reflect on our connections with other people and how we relate to one another. So again, do we have those established relationships to begin with? And then finally, when those two conditions are satisfied, we can think, we can learn, we can plan. I think one of the things that I observed coming out of the pandemic was there's an awful lot of concern about the academic losses, without consideration of the fact that none of us, the adults, Dr. Fauci, whoever else was out there, we didn't know what was coming next. I don't know if folks remember the first year coming back where we're wearing masks, we're 6 feet apart, we're not wearing masks. So the rules kept changing, right? That lack of predictability caused us to feel less safe. And we weren't connected necessarily. We were physically distanced, but we were focusing on learning. And again, we just talked about the sequence of engagement. We can't get to learning if those other two things are not taken care of. So I want you to also think about when your kids are coming to you. And I don't know who's got the dramatic high schoolers out there. I've got the dramatic 11-year-old. I've really had to think about how when she comes to me very, very stressed, I can't immediately go into fixing the problem and having the conversation about fixing the problem with her. First, I have to get us to a place where, okay, she's calm, I'm calm. I can say I really care. I want to hear what you're saying. And then finally, when those things are sort of rectified, we can talk about what comes next. She has said to me so many times, Mommy, I don't want you to fix it. I just want you to listen. So out of the mouths of babes. And I don't know if that's the case with your kids or not. Maybe they're more willing to hear from you in terms of your suggestions. But, I think this is a very, I think a useful tool, even when I'm working with colleagues, right? So even your people at work or your family members, this can be a really useful tool. So far, so good?
Yes.
When we start to think about some of the effects of toxic stress and trauma from a physical perspective, again, when we think about the brain, this is brainstem, we see our sensory systems getting impacted. We might be overwhelmed by noises. We might be overwhelmed by touch. I know a lot of kids that I've experienced with are very reactive to unexpected touch. And I'm Italian. We like to hug. So I've really had to train myself to say to someone, is it okay if I sit closer to you? Is it okay if I put my arm around you? Some other physical signs of stress and trauma, again, having stomach aches or gastrointestinal issues, headaches. We see disruption to sleep. So having a hard time falling asleep, having a hard time staying asleep. So if you're seeing any of those signs or symptoms in you or your kids, just kind of keeping a mindful eye. Doesn't mean that trauma is the cause, but these are all things that we need to feel our best. From a behavioral perspective, kids that have experienced trauma have a really hard time inhibiting their impulses. Again, they don't have that prefrontal cortex that says, stop, pause. If you do this, it's going to result in something negative. So again, when we think about discipline, in schools, let's say a kid gets into a fight, but meanwhile, the kid has been sort of bullied by another child for, let's say, 2 months. And this is the first time they finally are like, I can't take it anymore. And they hit one. It's not that there shouldn't be a consequence, but the question is, how much have they tried to cope with this before? Again, you might see kids outwardly aggressing, being more physical. On the flip side, you might see kids with low energy who are withdrawing. I often say, like, kids with their hood on. A teacher might perceive them as being disengaged or inattentive, but perhaps it's them just trying to stay regulated. And again, from a behavioral perspective, we're seeing folks that have experienced trauma oftentimes turning to substances to, sort of numb those uncomfortable feelings, because the reality is experiencing trauma is not something that is widely spoken about. When we think about those statistics about how many folks have experienced trauma, they're probably higher. But I think a lot of folks don't report them for a variety of reasons. Maybe there's shame. Maybe from a cultural perspective, it's normal. Maybe they're afraid that if they do report it, then that's going to result in some negative consequence for the family. I've worked with students who, have experienced sexual abuse in the home, and their younger sibling has as well. And they did not disclose because they were so afraid that if they were out of the home, that their younger sibling would continue to be affected by that. Okay. So there's a variety of reasons why we don't talk about it as much as perhaps we should. From an emotional perspective, again, we're seeing those signs of anxiety. We're seeing signs of depression. Not feeling like you have any autonomy or control. So there's a lot of times where kids it's sort of like learned helplessness. Why am I going to bother trying? Nothing I've ever done in the past has resulted in anything changing for me. Hypervigilance is one thing I do like to bring up. Kids that have experienced trauma and don't have trusting relationships oftentimes are just watching and waiting for something to happen. They're constantly in a state of stress and fear. Okay. And then from a self-concept perspective, and again, bringing it back to that original study I was talking about, the Fleety study, where women that had lost weight really were uncomfortable with the attention they were getting, not feeling worthy, feeling a lot of shame and guilt, having distortions of body image or body dysmorphia. And then on the flip side, sometimes we also see kids that are overcompensating. They brag a lot, or maybe they're telling stories that we know can't possibly be true, because again, they're trying to preserve that sense of self and feel valued. And then finally, from a thinking perspective, we got to bring it back to thinking. We got to bring it up to that reasoning part of the brain, because ultimately our job in schools is to help kids learn, right? I do think, though, we need to be very mindful of, for some of our kids that have struggled with stressful situations or trauma, are we considering those behaviors as automatic responses, or are we assuming that there's will involved, that they're purposefully doing that? And I think, unfortunately, we do that sometimes. So we miss the opportunity to connect. And frankly, then we don't get to the learning piece. And for kids that have experienced trauma, many studies have identified that they have weaker communication skills. So they're going to have a harder time advocating and saying, I feel really stressed or overwhelmed by this. I need this tool, or I need that tool. Again, we see deficits in memory functioning. So oftentimes when we have a kid that has a trauma response to something stressful, I think we oftentimes will ask kids, well, why did you do that? And oftentimes kids that have experienced trauma, they can't tell you why they did that, because they were in that sort of automatic state of fight, flight, and freeze. Memory functioning was not intact. So they really don't have an in-order recollection or a linear recollection of what happened. Also, they have difficulties with cause and effect. So again, stopping and thinking, if I do this, this will be a good outcome. If I do this, I might get in trouble. So I'm going to choose that. Not having that capacity to stop and think. Again, I know I've been kind of talking about this along the way, but protective factors. There are definitely some themes here. Number one, relationships. Again, when we think about babies and when they're crying or when they're appealing to mom and dad, is someone there to respond? Because if there's not someone there to respond, they don't learn how to develop relationships where they trust that someone will be there to support them when they need it. Again, feelings of success. And that success could be in a variety of ways. I think, unfortunately, in the culture we're in right now, we spend an awful lot of time thinking about academic success when we are multifaceted, right? We have an opportunity to develop competence in many different arenas. So are we making sure that we're giving kids those opportunities? And then, support through religious or faith-based affiliations. Maybe, I'm so sorry, my kids are walking in now, so I'm distracted. Do we have some sort of a peer support group that exists out there that we feel part of the fabric of that group and culture and we're valued in it? In family, we're thinking about, again, positive relationships, their expectations. So we hold kids accountable. It's not that if a kid is aggressive or breaks a rule, we don't hold them accountable for it, but are we actually taking them through a more restorative practice where they understand the why we would expect them to do differently and how can we fix it moving forward? And then from a community-based perspective, are we living in a community where folks have access to housing and folks have access to childcare and healthcare and community supports and health centers? Because those are our fundamental needs, right? Access to food. So I think, even in some circumstances, and I always share this story, I'm looking at the time, but my grandmother is a remarkable person and her ACE score is really, really high. And she was born in Poland in a town that was invaded by Russia, and then went on a train to Siberia, lost her mom along the way, ended up in Tanzania for 10 years and was part of a camp there. Ultimately moved to England, met my grandfather. They had children. They moved to the States. When they moved to the States, again, they were non-native English speakers, but there was a community of Polish folks that all knew each other, and they took them in, and they all lived together and had that community. And ultimately, they bought their home, lived in their home. And again, experienced other adversities. So again, first generation, my uncle was a substance abuser, probably had undiagnosed ADHD, went to parochial school, suffered abuse there, and then became a substance abuser and ultimately was killed in a gun violence incident. And yet my grandmother's 91. She gardens, she drives, she reads, she cooks, she does all of the things. And has a positive outlook on life still after all of those experiences that had the potential to result in trauma. What is it that she had? She had community. She had faith. She had all of those things and values those things. So I think it's really important to remember, even when we've experienced adversity, many of us come out on the other side of that. Any questions? Is it slow enough? We're good?
Yes, perfect.
Okay. So in the work that I'm doing at present, I think the most important part perhaps of this conversation is, again, you see in the center, there's that definition of trauma. So there's an event or series of events that's experienced and then has some long-term effects. In the orange circle, we have the 4 R's of trauma-informed care. So this is, how do we become more trauma-informed? How do we make sure that we are thinking about what people might have experienced when we're working with them? So we start to realize how prevalent trauma is. We start to recognize those signs and symptoms and respond in a way that's trauma-informed. The green circle on the outside is the 6 principles of trauma-informed care. And guess what? The phrases that are up there, the words that are up there, they don't scream trauma. Safety is a fundamental right. We all have the right to feel safe, not just physically, but emotionally. Trust and transparency. When we communicate with people, do we trust them? Do we trust that they're not going to share that information? Collaboration and mutuality. We all have to work together. So these are not things that are very trauma specific. They're really about climate and relationships. In the last year, we interviewed about 100 high school students. Some students, believe it or not, from Greenwich, some from Stanford, the majority from Fairfield County. And one of the principles is empowerment, voice, and choice. So the question being, are we, and I said this at the beginning, soliciting feedback from folks in a way that's very meaningful and they feel like they're heard? Because that's what brings people to the table and helps people want to work together. So last year, 2023, again, we conducted some focus groups about those 6 principles. So I wanted to share a little bit the information, the feedback we got, because, at the end of the day, they deserve and have the right to contribute to decisions about their lives, their experiences, their schooling. And I don't know that we do a good enough job of actually seeking that information actively. So I just wanted to share some of this. We had them do a word cloud and asked them to define trauma. And as you can see, they did a pretty good job. When we think about those 3 E's, they got experience, they got event. So I feel like they had a pretty good understanding of what toxic stress and trauma were. The first question we asked them, we said, what does safety in school mean to you? And we collected this information via interview, and we were in relatively small groups, but there were definitely some common buckets of experience that kids shared back. Number one, folks definitely spoke about physical safety, which I think in schools, at least from a facilities perspective, we do a good job, right? We've got Raptor, we lock the doors, we practice our fire drills. The kids did us one better, because I don't think we spend enough time thinking about psychological or emotional safety. Do I feel safe being me in this space? Do I feel like if I make a mistake, that's okay? That I learn from making mistakes? Am I free to be myself, whether that have to do with gender identity or interests? So again, just being able to be your true self and to say what you think without fear of retribution. Another theme that came up was feeling welcomed. And I think for parents, I often think about that. There were some buildings I worked in, when you walked in that door, there was no one there to greet you. Maybe there was a secretary there or an administrative assistant, and sometimes they ignored you. And then there were others where, like, the second you walked in, you just knew it was a place that you could feel comfortable, and they cared enough to make that connection. Another thing from a safety perspective is that a lot of the kids said that they had some fear of reporting issues or incidents, or fear of reporting their concerns about their own mental health. And then finally, there was sort of a mixed view on the presence of SROs or law enforcement officials in schools. In some communities, law enforcement is seen as, and rightfully so, as folks that are not there to keep us safe, they're there to punish us. I think that's a truth in some communities. And I think there are other cases where we have school resource officers where they make themselves present for all of the things in the school, just not to enact punishment, right? Any questions? Anything surprising?
I think for me, Dana, when I first heard you speak, I don't even know when, so long, I feel like it was so long ago, but it wasn't, that our students today are under so much stress, and there's a lot of anxiety in the school right now. And I think that all of those things, I mean, even if we're not talking about some of those more, what could be construed as the more serious areas of trauma, some of the stress levels that our kids are under are extraordinarily high.
Absolutely. And I think that, again, comes back to safety. Are we cultivating a place where it's not where you go that's important, it's about who you are right here and right now? So I think that's a big thing. And I think we're also in a culture of compare and despair, right? So a lot of kids, in terms of, you think about social media and you think about the technology that's out there, the information is moving so fast and furious that we don't always have the luxury of, or consciously take the time to slow down and really think that through, or think about what we might need to feel better, right? Next was trustworthiness and transparency. And we asked the students, do you ask for help at school? Why or why not? Again, coming back to a lot of kids, while they acknowledged that they had needs and they were anxious or they were sad, a lot of the time they were not as willing to seek support because there was some stigma, or they were uncomfortable. And there were certain groups that it was very clear that, if you go to the guidance office, then that means that you're depressed or you're anxious, when in fact, it might not mean that at all. You may be going to plan your schedule. But again, a lot of filling in the blanks for kids when they don't necessarily know the function or the reason. A lot of them, and I will say I was grateful for this, did have those one or two go-to teachers that they could rely upon. Again, going back to high school, I think it's super challenging. They're shifting between potentially 7 teachers in one day. So I think we don't have the luxury of time to make more meaningful connections and relationships with our kids. And also you have to think about, we're all different. And I think if any of us were in a school and we each taught a class, each student would have a different experience with us. So I'm thinking about their need to kind of pivot as they move from class to class and adjust who they are based on the teacher's demeanor or their experiences there. Another thing they talked a lot about is that the adults in the schools are very much focused on academics and college. And we know that that may not be the route for everyone. And we don't value that as much anymore. In certain places and spaces. And the kids are feeling that. And then finally, that counselors were not as available to them for support if the problem was not academic. More often than not, if they went to go see a counselor about anxiety, the counselor might send them to someone else or call home and say, you need to find a therapist. So there was this sense that they didn't have that person if they needed that higher level of support, not just a teacher that they can sort of vent to. In terms of peer support, so to define peer support is when we are in a space with someone who has the same lived experience as us. So for example, I have epilepsy. I'll use that as an example. So if I were engaged with a group of folks and we're all talking about our experiences with epilepsy, we can assume some understanding, right? So for example, I know that this particular group is geared towards Hispanic parents. So that in a sense is peer support. Even though we're coming from, I'm sure, a diversity of backgrounds, culture, countries, having some commonality. So asking the kids, are there any opportunities for peer support? And what would that program look like? I think all of them resoundingly said that it would be a very helpful thing, especially because when you see something about you that you struggle with and someone else is struggling with the same thing, you feel a little less alone. But there were some concerns for things like privacy and confidentiality. And again, we know we're in a place now where kids are recording conversations or taking videos and then sharing them on social media. So I think that was one of the concerns. And we saw that primarily in districts that were very, very, very small. So those were some of the things that kids had shared back with us. Are there any venues for peer support in Greenwich? Obviously, this being one place or space.
I think so. And for students, there's lots of opportunities to get involved. I think the size could be daunting for kids. And even figuring out how to make those connections can be hard. But once they do, I feel they seem to find
They take advantage of it
Yeah.
and use it as a good collaboration and mutuality. So again, are we talking about mental health? Are we trying to solve these problems? And I also think about this from a parent perspective. Like, are you truly part of the decision-making process in school? So oftentimes I refer to the PPT process. So if you have a child who has an individualized education plan or an IEP, when you come to that PPT meeting, do you feel like you have equal decision-making power to all of the educators at that table? Because you should. And if you don't, that's something we need to really work hard at, making sure that there is equity in that decision making, that conversation. Again, when we asked more specific questions about mental health, and many of the kids again reiterated that the focus is very much on academics, and or mental health is talked about in very sort of short amounts of time, whether it be in a health class or just one semester, and it's sort of a standalone thing. It's not talked about on the regular. But there was a sense from the kids that felt like it should be a conversation that happens more regularly, because guess what? We all have brains and we all have health. So we all have mental health. It's not something to be afraid of. So in terms of, we actually surveyed the kids, and about 50% said that they do have programs in classes where they talk about mental health. About 10% said no. And then there were another 37% who were daydreaming that day, and they're not sure if that was part of the conversation or not. Empowerment, voice, and choice. And again, that was the whole function of us surveying kids. How are we making sure that we are soliciting information from all of our kids, not just the president of the student council and not just the president of the class, and again, and not just our quarterback? How are we making sure that we're giving everyone an opportunity? And I think sometimes when folks don't feel valued, they're less likely to throw their opinions out there. So we asked, what do they do to solicit your voice? Again, they said sometimes they're holding groups. They have an anonymous alert system. So if you have an issue or you're worried about something, you can send a report. Sometimes they do, surveys with students. But one of the concerns and frustrations was that we're doing these surveys, we're giving this information out, but nothing is changing as a result of it. So again, I think it's so important for the adults to hear and then also close that feedback loop and share it back out and saying, I hear that you're upset about this, or I hear that this is an area of need and this is how we're going to address it. Or even better, ask the kids, how do you think we can address it? Right? So that's true empowerment. And then finally, cultural, historical, and gender factors. I spend a lot of time working with districts looking at disproportionality and discipline. This is a national trend in Connecticut. I think it's even more obvious that when we look at disciplinary rates, our students that are African American, Hispanic are disciplined at far higher rates than white students, even for similar infractions. And again, this goes back to our earlier conversation about racial oppression. So when we asked kids about their experiences with discipline in schools, they said that there are some themes, again, removal from class, which I would argue, again, that severs the relationship with that teacher, right? That's a physical disconnect from that place and space. One student had said that she got really, really upset in class, was very tearful and left the class because she was very embarrassed, and she ended up getting a detention for leaving class without permission. So again, the adults perhaps not taking the time to consider what are some of the other factors that might be leading to this behavior. One of the districts that we were working with had a very clearly defined process. They were very actively trying to work against that disproportionate practice and working on restorative practices, which essentially is, how do we learn from a mistake? Not just a punishment, because a punishment is going to fix that problem right here and right now, but it's not necessarily going to change the behavior or the mindset of the student or the teacher. And again, sort of to sum it all up, finding that more holistic view of behavior to be really, really essential, and trying to get the perspective of all folks, not just the perpetrator, but also the victim, and how do we bring everybody back together. And I see Di, you've raised a hand.
Yes, hi. I have a question.
Sure.
If one of the teenagers feels in class that the teacher is not cooperative, or you're not, one of the favorites, what is a good solution without dismiss your kids? What is the solution for your kids to not tell them, oh, no, just walk away or take it? And then, like you said, some adults are not very regulated. So what is a good advice that you can tell us, that we can tell our kids to do in a moments like that? When, when the discrepancy is a dysregulated adult.
It's a very, very good question. And if I had a perfect answer for it, I would be rich and I would never have to work again. We talk a lot about this because at the end of the day, our students in high school, they're still children, right? Up until 25, 26, when that prefrontal cortex is developed, it doesn't mean we don't hold them accountable. And when I think about regulation, we have to go first. The adults have to go first, because if we don't set the tone for regulation, our kids are not going to follow suit. So that is a really challenging situation to be in. That said, it sounds like you've had conversations with, I'm assuming, your child about this. I think one of the best things you can do is, when you're outside of that situation, you're sitting with them, what can we plan ahead of time, or how can we advocate, whether it means we write an email to the teacher and ask, can we have a conversation together? This is what I'm noticing. This is what, I might need, or what do you need from me? And that might require some mediation. Maybe it's not just the teacher. Maybe if they have another trusted adult that they work with, bringing them into the conversation, and sort of planning out how do I address this? Because at the end of the day, teacher's goal is likely for the child to learn, right? The child's goal is to learn. So we have the same goal. So I think it's about, where do we find that common ground? And it's unfortunate that we would have to put the onus on a student in that case to set the tone for that interaction. And at the same time, that is absolutely the truth. Did that answer your question? And again, I don't have the perfect answer. I really wish I did.
Yes, thank you.
And I think, and to your point, I think sometimes we tell kids just walk away, which is a strategy that can work in some cases. And at the same time, we need our kids to start advocating for themselves as well. And I think sometimes there's a fear of doing that because we think that there's going to be some sort of consequence to us being honest and authentic.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dana. That's amazing information. Appreciate all of it. Does anyone have any more questions for Dana? I know that you are just wrapping up a few more things, I think.
Yeah, I think when we left and we talked to the students and even the families that I've been working with, some of the questions that remained were, what are we doing from an active perspective to solicit feedback? Is it just the survey that we ask once a year? Are we inviting families in? Are we inviting kids in? Are we making sure we're hearing from all of our families? I think everyone knows you've got that one person in your family who's the loudest, right? And they dominate the conversation. I think that happens in districts too. I think there are some parents that dominate the conversation. So how do we make sure there's equitable representation? And for those folks that are not as engaged, trying to dig a little deeper and say why, what are the barriers, making sure that we get a really well-rounded perspective of the needs of everyone. And then finally, after we have that information, and back to the kids saying that there's no observable change, how are we bringing that information back out for discussion and actually tying it to something we want to do to make change? Any questions? Thoughts, concerns, Di?
Yeah, sorry, I think I'm overtaking. I want to take advantage of your meeting. Sorry.
No, that's fine.
So my question now, it's in a personal matter that, because as an adult, I was raised under a lot of stress. So I was a person who was always very hyper, and so I learned how to cope with, under the stress. It's like I put my feelings on my pocket and you have to, I self-regulate. And because of that, I don't know how to help my daughter to do that, without leaving the stress that I let, because now she's very unregulated. She's a teenager.
Mm-hmm.
So how I can help her to regulate her emotions, like you said, you were given the example when they are very hyperactive and they have an issue and they just come to you and they are very hyper excited,
Mm-hmm.
and very emotional. How you help them to regulate that part without, help them to calm if like breathing doesn't help?
Right.
The basic sense.
I think one thing that I always try to encourage folks to do is to make sure you have those conversations about what you observe and your desire to help when kids are not under stress. So I think it's about talking about it outside of that moment, because in that moment, again, we talked about it, when we're stressed, we're not making the best decisions. We're not necessarily thinking clearly, even if our intention is to help. So the point being, having those conversations when we're not stressed, when we're in just a regulated state and we can think about it rationally, we can think about it calmly and say, what's our plan going to be, right? What's our plan going to be to stay regulated? And what are those cues that we're going to use? And I think the other piece is telling someone to calm down when they're stressed. We know that that doesn't work. And if taking deep breaths is not something you're practicing when you're not under stress, you're probably not going to be able to use it when you're under stress. So we have to build habits with these strategies that we're using, right? We have to have them ready to go in our pocket. And I think it's also about exploring. There are a million different ways to help regulate our nervous system. Some people like to doodle. Some people literally throwing cold water on your face actually is a stress reliever, believe it or not. So that, you've heard people say, oh, go put some cold water on your face. It actually, it triggers sort of like a decrease of cortisol in your system. So I think it's about looking what are some of the things that we can do. And I can share some resources with Michelle if Michelle wants to share them out with the group. And I think it's about being mindful and planning this out with your child. And also forgiveness, knowing that in the heat of the moment, sometimes we say things that we don't mean, right? And sort of coming back and saying that hurt me. And I know that maybe that wasn't your intention. I think that that's one thing that we forget sometimes, that, and especially with our high schoolers, they're full of all sorts of big feelings. And again, if they've experienced a lot of stress, it's going to be harder for them to tap into those strategies if they're not fluent with them.
Okay.
The only thing I would add to that is that within the schools, we do have social workers and psychologists and counselors that can help support you and your student. So you can always reach out to your student school counselor who can help connect you with a social worker if that's something that might be helpful for you. Sometimes counselors can also meet with you. I know I used to always, I found myself as that intermediary between the parent and the kid during post-secondary discussions about what they were doing after high school, because there are oftentimes differences of opinion. The kids saying they want to go to Hawaii, like sometimes crazy things just because they want to leave. So that's part of why we're here. We're not just here for academic support. We're also here to help families and to help kids. So you can always reach out to the counselors in school for further support if you're having a problem at home.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And for adding to my question, so how, as a parent, we can increase the self-esteem of the girl? Because, girls are different than boys. So high school girls get meaner. So how we try to help them to higher those emotions and make them, because it's a big discrepancy, like you say, in a social matter. It's not the same, a birthday girl for some part of the girls than the others.
Right.
Someone can get just one present, the other one can get a helicopter. So the discrepancy it brings out is heavier as a teenager.
Right. The
So
haves
how
and
you
the
can
have-nots, right?
So how you can help, increase, I guess, the balance it out and make them feel that it's okay, and increase self-esteem, I guess.
Yeah. Well, I also think self-esteem, we have to help them tie self-esteem to intrinsic factors, things about them from a personal perspective that are valuable, not things, right? So I think we do live in this culture of, and I used the phrase before, compare and despair, right? We look on social media and we see that this one went to their house in Hawaii twice last month, and meanwhile I went to my job, and that's not as exciting, right? But I think it's so much about emphasizing it's not what we have, and it's not necessarily what we do. It's what internal skills do I have that are valued by other people, right? What do I bring to my relationships? Because relationships are really central to it. I think that's the other piece. And nurturing the talent. Every kid has some sort of mission or some sort of valuable talent or skill. And if they don't have it yet, trying to help figure out what that is. And again, sometimes it's not academics for kids. Sometimes it's music. Sometimes it's sports. Sometimes it's reading. And I think also just sort of finding ways to help them tap into whatever peer support groups might be available. So I don't know with your daughter if she has connections or has, even one good friend. Like some kids have lots and lots of friends, but they're not very meaningful friendships, whereas some people have just one really, really good friend. So again, I don't know that I fully answered that question. I'd be rich if I could answer it. But again, emphasize, and I think we as adults, I'm saying goodbye to Franco. Thank you.
Hi, we're wrapping up. Thank you for coming.
Thanks for coming. I think this is a much broader conversation, and I think it certainly speaks to what the students that we met with felt that they needed more of opportunity to have conversations with other high schoolers about these things that they're all going through, right?
Well, Dana, thank you so much. And if anyone has further questions, please feel free to reach out to me and I can try and help you, or I can connect you with Dana. Did you have a question? No.
No.
Oh, okay. And this has been recorded, so I will go through the necessary steps I need to get it posted on our website, along with Dana mentioned you have some resources I can also post to share with you. So I'll let everyone know when that's up and ready for you. Okay.
Thank you so much. You say you're gonna have your information, your email, if we need further contact.
Well, I can actually put it in the chat right now. And Michelle, I'm sure I will share out these slides, and my email will be listed on there.
So you can, so the chat is here, but you can also, when this is posted online, you'll be able to have access to her email in that information as well.
Oh, thank you so much. Where is gonna be shared in? You said, sorry.
I will send, so in the same way that I announced this presentation, I will send out a follow-up to say that our evening has been recorded and is now available, and I'll let you know where it's available, and there will, and what the other resources that are attached to it can be. Okay?
Thank you so much for having me, and I wish I could see you all in person, maybe at another point. But I'm grateful to have had the opportunity to learn a little bit more and to share just the bare basics. These are really the basics, and at the same time, our students, their voice and their input is so valuable, and we need to make a conscious effort to find ways to let them tell us what they need.
Awesome. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Claro que sí.
Que me hablen en español.